Richard Dawkins, who's one of those people that have tried to point out some of these areas, who gives a recommendation to a couple to abort their Down syndrome baby, and people responded with outrage. And again, you go back historically, because he's really not off the mark there. Historically speaking, he's in line with some of the other thinkers. Why is that something that first of all, why is it such a surprise to people that he would say that when he's compared historically? And two, how is it so difficult for people to see how far we've moved in that regard to where we're at now?
When people are outraged at that, it's their Christianity that's getting outraged, right? It's their Christianity that is troubling them about that. Because Dawkins is absolutely right to say, when people were outraged at him, he pointed out quite rightly, why are you getting outraged? This is in fact what 98% of all mothers do when they discover Down syndrome in the womb. This is in fact what our human society is doing, right? I'm only advising somebody to do what actually the vast majority of our society does indeed do when they are put into this position. And we can add to what Richard Dawkins says and say that down through history, it is in fact what human civilizations have always done with disabled children, right? Infanticide is near enough to a human universal. You know, Tacitus wrote about a couple of Germanic tribes that were discovered back in the 1st century that did not practice infanticide, and it was so noteworthy that he had to write it down. Oh, it's remarkable. They don't kill their disabled children. They don't kill their little girls. It has always been a feature of human civilizations that they kill off the weak, the low, and the botched, as Friedrich Nietzsche would have put it. And so Dawkins, in saying, abort a disabled child and try again, is saying, A, what our culture does in fact do, and B, what cultures around the world and down through history have always done. And so, in fact, the thing I want to point out in that whole Richard Dawkins affair is actually the response to Richard Dawkins, because Dawkins is not historically an outlier. Historically, Richard Dawkins is just the very first manual of midwifery was from the 1st century, a Roman manual of midwifery. The first chapter of this Roman manual of midwifery is entitled On How to Discern the Offspring Worth Raising. That's job number 1. Okay, if you're a midwife, if you're standing at the gate to life, you want to figure out if it's worth raising this child. And they've got to qualify for life. They've got to, and absolutely, it is a violation of our transcendent value of equality and our transcendent value of compassion. It's absolutely a violation of those things. But who taught us those things? It's Jesus who taught us those things. And so the outrage at Richard Dawkins for saying what he said is a distinctively Christian outrage. You ask the question, how do we get to where we are in our society? And there is still outrage at the idea of infanticide in our culture, which is, as Peter Singer points out, a somewhat inconsistent posture to take. What is the difference between a 5-minute-old baby and the existence of that baby 10 minutes earlier? What is the morally significant difference between a baby on one side of the birth canal and on the other side of the birth canal? Peter Singer is entirely right to point out that we are inconsistent on this. And if you allow for abortion on that side of the birth canal, why do you not allow for infanticide on the other side of the birth canal? He's entirely right to point to our inconsistency, and he's entirely right to point out that the reason why we're uncomfortable with this is Christianity. But pressing further, it's fascinating to me that the issue of the unborn in our culture, even as we take a particularly traditional, non-Christian approach to the unborn in our culture, and we search and destroy, as Richard Dawkins was advising this woman to do. If you detect Down syndrome, then you are to destroy that child. we still practice this very pagan practice, right? We are still in this very pagan mindset. But in order to forward the ends of the pro-choice movement, we have to dress it up in Christian language, and that's what's different. I wish that we were such a thoroughly Christian society that we used not only Christian language but actually followed through on it, and actually valued every single human life, whether unborn or born. What's happened in our society, we've become so Christianized that still there are those who practice abortion, but they do so using the rhetoric that Christianity has taught us. So it's about choice, which again is something that Christianity has brought into the world. This idea of consent, this idea of the individual, whose rights cannot be lost in the shuffle, whose rights cannot be traded away for the powerful and the strong. This idea of choice, this idea of bodily autonomy, again, it's a profoundly Christian idea. This idea that it is healthcare. Well, my goodness, like who is it who brought hospitals to the world? Who is it who brought this idea of compassionate care to all, and especially to the weak and needy and the sick and the vulnerable? It's a women's issue, and men don't have a right to say because there's a power differential, and women should be given that dignity to have their own voice. Like, who is it who's taught the world that kind of gender equality? Who is it who's taught the world choice? Who is it that's taught the world bodily autonomy? Who is it who's taught the world healthcare? And one of the markers of how Christianized our discourse has become is that even as people advocate for entirely pagan practices, they cannot help but do it and forward it in Christian language. They dress it up in Christian language.